Welcome back to PLS 510. Today I want to start the lecture series on hay production and feeding. I have broken this down into three pieces that you can spread over 2 lecture days if you want to do it that way. It's the same amount of material as we would cover in class in 2 days, but there are some natural breaking points, and I'm going to split the lecture that way for your convenience. So let's get started on talking about hay production. First of all, stored forage or hay is necessary in Kentucky because our normal grazing season is only about 9 to 10 months. That means we have to plan for about a 3-month hay feeding period. Another point about hay I want to make on the front end is that the quality of preserved forages will almost never be as high as it was in the field when you cut it, and that's due to harvest and storage losses. But I do want to remind you of 3 ways that hay does actually improve a little bit in storage after it's cut, just to tie together some earlier lectures. What are those 3 exceptions? I'm going to just put those numbers down and let you think about that for a minute or two. The first one I would mention would be the ergovaline content in tall fescue hay. Ergovaline, of course, is the toxin that causes the tall fescue toxicosis, and it declines by about 50% once you cut it and make hay. The next would be the prussic acid potential for hay. Of course, the hays that have prussic acid potential are mainly the sorghum Sudan type hays or Johnson grass if you cut it for hay. And as it cures and the leaf dries, then the prussic acid actually is evolved, or cyanide is evolved out, and the potential goes greatly down. And the third one that we haven't talked about very much, but it has to do with the tannins that make Sericea lespedeza bitter, and those disappear almost completely in hay. So hay will never be better after it's cut. It'll always be good. I mean, it'll never be as high in protein and energy as the day it was cut. But there are 3 exceptions to how hay might actually improve a little bit in storage. So I do want to make you aware and remind you that hay production is seasonal on top of that. This just happens to be one of our scenarios that you turned in for your livestock forage balance from the NRCS Graze tool. And you know we've got that surplus of forage in the April, May, June, and a little bit here in summer. And then we have this deficit of forage here in November, December, January, February, and March. So we're always using the surplus from our spring and summer to fill in this deficit in the winter if we're going to carry animals across this whole time period. I'm also want to tie together an earlier lecture because there are 2 types of stored feed. Now, this is from the very first lecture we had, and we were defining what forage is, and we said it was pasture, hay, and silage. So hay is where we cut grasses and legumes in the field, let them dry, and then bale them for feeding at a later date. Silage is those same grasses and legumes chopped or baled wet and rolled up wet, and then let them ferment so that they can be preserved. When they're chopped and put into silos, the vertical kind or the bunker type, or even plastic bags that are long and horizontal, that wet material becomes anaerobic and ferments, and that's what makes it stable. And that's what we know as silage. If you compare hay and silage just a little bit, hay is simpler to make, easier to feed, but with a greater chance for weather damage because it has to stay in the field longer to dry down. It can be stored more easily, and by that I mean there are more locations on the farm where you can put it. You're not limited to where you can put it, in terms of movement. It's drier, it's easy to move. There is the potential for off-farm use and marketing because you can transport it easier. And the reason why it's easier is because there's less moisture. So it's more efficient. You're not hauling around a bunch of water. And at the proper moisture content, hay is more stable when fed than silage. And we do have to remember that nitrates that we bind up or make up in drought-stressed hay will still be a problem in hay, where prussic acid will not. To talk about silage or baleage, and this is a good place to make a distinction, silage and baleage are both fermented, wet, anaerobic feeds, forage. Baleage is doing it by baling up very wet material and wrapping it with plastic wrap and letting it ferment inside that package. Silage is cutting it, then chopping it usually, and getting it blown into or moved into some sort of storage structure, like a tower silo, a bunker silo, or even a plastic bag. This is a more complicated process. You got to get the moisture content right. In the case of baleage, there's plastic wrapping. There is much less chance for weather damage, which is one of the great reasons why we do make silage or haylage or baleage. It's almost uniformly going to be higher in forage quality because we're able to get it more at the right stage of maturity and have lower mechanical losses, because we're moving it in the field and raking it and manipulating it when it's wetter, and we have fewer physical losses. I will say it usually requires more labor in that you've got to do all the steps of baling, plus you must wrap it as well, or do something to move it into the storage structure that becomes anaerobic. With baleage, we have plastic management issues, and we do have to worry about botulism and poor fermentation in baleage or silage. And we'll take up a lot of these issues after our lectures on hay production. Another comparison between hay and the silage, haylage, baleage system. With hay, storage stability depends on the low moisture content that we arrive at by leaving it in the field. And those dry matter losses that we get with hay depend on how much rain damage it gets, the physical losses during curing, and the storage losses due to heating and weather if the bales are outside prior to feeding. With our fermented forage, the storage stability depends on the anaerobic conditions and the adequate fermentation in the silo or bale package. The dry matter losses depend on the moisture content at baling, the final pH of the silage or haylage or baleage, and that pH that baleage is acidified, or the forage is acidified due to fermentation, and how well we keep the plastic integrity. In other words, patch holes. How well, and if you apply that to other systems besides plastic wrapped hay bales, it would be how well you maintain anaerobic conditions. So, as I said, we've got three pieces to this. We're going to talk about hay processing and cutting management. We're going to talk about hay equipment, and we're going to talk about hay storage and feeding. So let's talk about the process. The process of making hay are these 5 things: mowing, and in some cases we condition it at the same time depending on the equipment. The drying phase, where we may use a tedder, which is a fluffer. It's a agitator in a sense that will spread out hay and help it to absorb more solar radiation. And raking, which is preparing the hay usually from a very wide and spread out arrangement to something concentrated in what we call a windrow, which is about the size of the opening of the baler so that you can make hay. Then there's the operation of forming the bale package, the baling. Then we have storage and feeding. And don't forget, the last 2 steps are not thought about a whole lot, at least maybe not initially in making hay, but they can result in the greatest amount of storage loss depending on our management. So let's talk about cutting management decisions. We got to talk about when to time the mowing. When are we going to cut it? And it's a quantity compromise. Cutting early is higher quality, but lower yield. The longer we let it lay in the field, which raises the yield usually, the greater we have a potential for rain damage. We also have to make decisions about cutting height, and by that I want you to think about regrowth. That is often a discussion or a thinking about a principle that has to do with stubble leaf area. and it's species dependent because the leaf area at the lower portion of an alfalfa plant or a red clover plant is almost nothing. So therefore, once you're cutting alfalfa or red clover, going lower is not going to make much difference, a slight difference in quality, but not much difference in regrowth because there's no leaf area on those legumes at that level. With grasses, of course, there is leaf area close to the ground, and so therefore the stubble height or how low you cut makes a big difference. And we've talked about that a lot with orchard grass in particular needing a taller residual, whether you're grazing or haying. And then, of course, there's the frequency. How often are we going to cut? And we have to consider several things, of course, the rainfall and the weather and those sorts of things. But usually, with the weather aside, we're talking about when we want to cut such that the carbohydrate reserves in the roots or the regrowth structures are replenished. And that also is a species dependent decision. Now, one of the things that I do think is gravely important. There is almost nothing more important than this in this lecture, that maturity at cutting is the most important factor affecting forage quality. And that statement that I made earlier that the hay is never better than the day it's cut, except for those three circumstances we mentioned. This is the point that we're making: is that every day, that when you cut it, that is the highest level of protein and energy that forage will ever have. And after that, we're trying to preserve it by how we rake, bale, ted, handle, store, all those things. So the maturity at cutting is the most important factor affecting forage quality. I think we've looked at this graph more than once, but of course, I make the point again that as we move from vegetative, low yield, to bloom, the highest yield, the things that we want in terms of animal performance, the digestibility and the intake, are declining the whole way. Obviously, our yield down here is not going to be adequate when it's just vegetative. So we're shooting for something here where we're in the boot stage, where the head is just beginning to come out or almost ready to come out, or we're beginning to see some reproductive structures on the legume, or when that has just popped out. So somewhere in this boot to early head is usually the perfect place, or the place that we're shooting for the best compromise between yield and the things that we want in terms of forage quality, which is digestibility and intake. Now I want to walk through this one table and pull out several points, because I have looked at this table and had it presented to me in different presentations. I will bet you 25 times, but I never saw all of the data, all of the implications, until I sat down one year and tried to put together a presentation on making the case to cut hay on time. And this is a study in Tennessee where fescue was cut at three different dates: May 3rd, May 14th, May 25th, and at the late boot to early head, the early bloom stage, and the early milk stage, and that's with the stage where the seed is forming. And I just make a comment that this is Tennessee, so a May 3rd date would be probably equivalent to about 10 days later up here in terms of us, or maybe a week. But these are still early cutting dates by anybody's measure in Kentucky for sure. Now, so they harvested fescue hay at these three stages. They fed it to 500-pound Holstein heifers. The intake, digestibility, they measured dry matter intake, digestibility, the percent protein in the hay, how much hay it took to produce a pound of gain, the yield, and the pounds of gain per day. So what I want to do is take this table apart, talk about all the implications of it using this data. So first thing is, yep, we cut hay at three different dates, and we have three different qualities. Dry matter intake goes down a lot. It goes down about a third when we go from just that delaying of about 22 days, 3 weeks. So we'd lose about a third of the intake. the digestibility drops 12 percentage units, which is about 20% of that original digestibility of 68%, which is awfully high. The next 2 points are the percent protein in the pounds of hay fed per pound of gain. And likewise, you'd expect the protein to go down. 14% or 13.8 is awfully good for grass hay. 7.6 is getting to be quite marginal in terms of its ability to, to meet the protein needs of even a dry cow. So it's a little low, but yet still it is not as far out of bed or as bad off as the energy content. But we'll talk about that in a future lecture. Another interesting thing is it takes a lot more hay, twice as much to make a pound of gain, over twice as much to make a pound of gain with the most mature compared to that early or late boot, early head material. And this is the aha. I mean, this is the thing that just staggered me. With these two columns, the pounds of hay fed per pound of gain and the pounds of hay per acre, I can figure out how much total gain was produced. And if you do the math, you divide the yield by the pounds of hay per pound of gain, you're going to come up with that figure. And you might not believe it, but this yield difference, which is more than twice, this 1,334 pounds produced about almost 130 pounds of gain, and so did this 2,823 pounds. It produced almost exactly the same amount of gain. So these 3 lots of hay produced the same total gain on those Holstein heifers, even though you've got a lot less yield. So in terms of these 3 evaluated as a system, we've got the same amount of gain to sell from each system. We were able to produce the gain faster on the late boot to early head stage material. Now I want you to think about what this would look like in the field. We cut hay May 3rd and removed it from the field, and we produced 130 pounds of gain with that hay. Well, come May 25th, that field has been growing for 22 days. And 22 days of hay growth in May is likely going to be all vegetative for tall fescue. So yes, we gave up yield, but we made the same amount of gain, not pounds per day. We got a lot more gain in terms of pound per day, but in terms of pounds per acre, same amount of gain per acre as this system, plus we end up with having an extra 22 days, 3 days of hay growth on that field. An astounding reason, or at least a strong argument for cutting hay on time. So one of the things that a principle that is true about ruminant nutrition and nutrition in general is that a little improvement has a large effect. And I want to associate that with the payback that you get with better hay quality. And to understand that, you have to think about how energy is partitioned from forages into the ruminant diet. And what happens is the animal meets their maintenance requirements first. So write maintenance on that first line. And everything left over from maintenance goes into production, whether it's gain or milk production, it'd be either you're making meat or you're making milk. So the second line would be production or gain or milk. And the thing to remember that is if every bit over the maintenance requirement goes into production. And I want you to think about it like making an extra house payment to the principal in a mortgage. I know you don't have a mortgage payment, but one day you might. And if you're buying a house, it was astounding to me that on a 30-year note, if you paid $100 more a month, you cut the amount of time it took to pay off that note from 30 years to 15 years. And that means that's a tremendous amount of savings, and it's the same principle. That means that extra $100 a month was being applied totally to lowering the principal of that note. Same principle, same thing at work here when we're petitioning energy from forage crops. A little bit of energy improvement, cutting earlier, will make a big difference in terms of performance. Now, a strategy to avoid rain damage, because if you talk to a producer group or if you're making a presentation and trying to convince people about when to make hay, when do you make hay? You make hay when it's not raining, when the sun is out. Now, how do you then, year in and year out, find those windows and make better hay? How do the good producers make better hay? Well, number one, they are ready early. They don't wait until the first week of May to check their hay equipment, make sure it's all greased up, everything is working. They've got twine or wrap or whatever. They are ready in April, because it never fails that there is a stable and warm weather pattern in the latter part of April where you might be able, or the early part of May, you might be able to get a hay cut and get that first cutting knocked down and off of the field. Another thing that they do is they make haylage or baleage, which means they're able to cut the forage and get it off the field, and they require fewer days of curing. But again, we'll talk more about that. And something that is not done as a system in general, and we don't ever probably get away from making cool season hay, but the more summer hay, warm season forage that you have to make into hay, the less you have to rely on making a bunch of hay or trying to make good hay with your cool season material when it's rainy, most often in the spring. So let's talk a little bit about optimum cutting stage, and this breaks it out in detail for several forage crops, the species on the left, the stage of growth in the middle, and the mowing height. And I would just like you to remember one thing for the stage of growth, that except for the case of Bermuda grass and the annual warm season grasses at the bottom, that transition stage from boot to early head or first flowering is going to be right 9 times out of 10. You can alfalfa as a species has been studied more than any other species, and so you've got a bunch of fine tuning of for the first cutting, you want to do it in the bud stage, and the others at a 10th bloom, and so on. But in point of fact, if in the year in and year out, if you have an alfalfa field, you're going to want to do it when you start feeling, you're going to want to be ready to cut when you can feel the buds swelling up in the tops of the alfalfa plant. So in terms of what you need to remember in practical terms, that boot to early head or bud to first flower is going to be correct for almost all of our forage crops. With Bermuda grass, you cut it when it gets tall enough to cut, and there will be seed heads present at this stage. And the annual warm season grasses are probably going to have heads or almost have heads when they get to be 30 or 40 inches tall. The mowing height's going to vary. Now, alfalfa mowing height, it says 2 to 4 inches here, and that's fine. It's more based on the height of the grass that you've got growing with it than it is about whether or not the alfalfa cares very much, whether it's cut to 2 or 4 inches. And the same thing goes with red clover. There's not much advantage to, say, stopping at 5 inches versus 3. The advantage is more probably due to the type of equipment that you have or how rough the field is, because you may set it at 5 inches, but because of the unevenness in a field, there may be places where you get lower, and so you may have to set it higher just because of the unevenness of a field. Bird's foot trefoil we haven't talked about very much, 3 to 4 inches. Orchard grass we've talked about a lot, 3 to 6 inches. So it's going to be higher, and I'd recommend, based on what we know, that you move it more close to the 6 than to the 3-inch height. Timothy 3 to 4, tall fescue 2 to 3. If bluegrass was on this list, it would be 2 to 3. I'd say practically you can't cut large acreages down to 1 inch like Bermuda grass has here, except with some very, very level fields and some very good equipment. So 2 inches is probably as low as you'll ever cut anything. So let's move on. So there's your mowing height. Let's talk about rain damage in hay, because it is probably the biggest concern about hay quality. It's the thing that drives us to cut later, is to try to avoid rain. So rain does reduce hay quality and quantity by leaching nutrients. It removes leaf tissues and by knocking it off, and by reactivating metabolism. And that would be the plant respiration and any microbial activity that's going on as that forage, that wet forage, is decomposing. Legumes are more highly affected, or more affected than grasses, because they have more cell solubles, more to leach out, and their leaves are more brittle. The factors that affect the amount of damage are the forage moisture content when rain occurs. And I probably should have made that little bullet in red, because it matters a whole lot whether when you get the rain, in terms of the drying of that crop. Rain on a wet crop is not as damaging as rain on a dry crop, and I'll show you that next slide. Of course, the amount and the intensity of the rainfall, it makes sense that that's going to be important, as also the duration. So here's the data that we use to talk about how rain causes more damage to nearly dry forage. This work was done here in Kentucky by Mike Collins in the 80s, and what we found was that in 1980, he had some alfalfa and red clover, cut it 3 stages, and he got some of it up with no rain, and some of it up they got an inch of rain after it was clipped. In other words, when it was fresh and wet. So you can see the decline there is very modest, and just almost none at all. If you look at 1981, same kind of scenario. You've got legumes cut at different stages. He got 4.1 centimeters. Now that's 2.5 centimeters here in 1980. That's 1 inch of rain. This is about 1.5, 1.75 during curing, and then he got that'd be 4 inches. 2.5 centimeters is 1 inch. 4 inches on dry hay. So that 4 inches of rain on dry hay took what was a very good alfalfa crop and made it into something that wasn't very good at all. 72 to 49. Same thing. That late bloom alfalfa went to, it was terrible. And then the red clover, same kind of drop in terms of the energy level of it. And so you can see that the later it is when the crop gets rained on, the bigger the damage. And we're going to see some boxes up here to help highlight this, but I did it, made the points without using them, but here we go. There's the decline in 1981 when we got rain late in curing at 2 different times. There's the decline due to maturity. There's 1980, after we got an inch of rain right after we got it clipped. And there's the drop in maturity. So rain causes more damage to nearly dry forage than when it falls on wet forage. So let's talk about the drying and the curing of hay. The drying process goal is to obtain moisture content below 20% as fast as possible, because this stops plant and microbial metabolic activity, and it's active on the good stuff, the carbohydrates that are easily chewed up by these organisms. So we want to preserve those. So the faster we get dry, the faster we preserve them, and we preserve then the nutritive value of the forage. How long this takes depends on some plant factors, how thick or how much of a cuticle, that'd be the waxy layer on stems and leaves, how mature the forage is. Mature forages have bigger stems. Sometimes they're a little drier. So, and also stem thickness matters. And the stomata, the openings in the leaf, matter. The environment matters, and that's quite obvious. The humidity, the solar radiation, the wind speed, the temperature. And then there's something we call the swath or the windrow architecture. How wide is it? How dense is it? Is it inverted? Can the air move into it? And we do manipulate that with that instrument we call the tedder. This is a data, it's based on real data of a drying crop and where the moisture comes from. And one thing I'd like you to take a look at, the moisture does decline over time in a drying crop. And the blue line represents the moisture content. And I want you to recognize that between 80%, which is fresh forage, and about 55 to 60% moisture, the drop is very rapid. But after that point, this decline in drying rate until we get down here to almost dry forage, and then we get very slow change over time. So the moisture that leaves the plant when it's fresh and wet is most often through the stomatal openings. We also can get some moisture that leaves there due to conditioning, and we'll talk about that with the type of mowers we're going to talk about. But conditioning refers to a physical manipulation of the crop as it's cut so that it is more prone, it has more places for water to leave the plant. And we'll talk about how that's done. The windrow formation matters too. If it's fluffy and there's more area and easier for wind to move through there. Then we get into the last phase, and that's the weather regulated. In other words, now we're depending on wind, sunlight, temperature, humidity differences to get that crop dry enough to bale. I want to present this information to reinforce a couple of points. This happens to be alfalfa. The second cutting is July. The third cutting on the right is September. This is in Pennsylvania. And we're looking at actually the drying curves there to get this alfalfa dry enough to bale. Now, in this study, they also, studied a drying agent called potassium carbonate. So the solid lines are potassium carbonate treated alfalfa. The dotted lines are untreated. So for our purposes, we're going to look at this untreated, the dotted lines. And you can tell that the first day, the drop in moisture content went from 80 down to just about, I'd say 48 or something like that. So we lost a great amount of the moisture content in the very first day. The next day, of course, we go back up from 40 or so, just below 50, up above 50, and that's going to be humidity, dew, you name it. Then, of course, by the end of the second day, we're dry enough to bale on the untreated forage. Third day, the moisture content goes back up a little bit and then drops down. This would be analogous to the dew on it, and then you're waiting for the dew to evaporate, and then you can start baling. Okay? So this is July, quite obviously a hotter, hotter time than September. And in September, take a look at what happens here with the drying slope, the slope of the drying curve. In this case, the first day's drying was much less, it dried at a less rapid rate than over here in the second cutting. So we only got down to about 60% moisture content versus below 50. But 60% after the first day, we popped it back up here to 70. We got down to about 35, back up to about 40. And it took up to the end of the third day in September to get into baling moisture range. And that's most likely due to temperature. It could be due to other factors. But at any rate, you can see that this first day we get a lot of the drying, or the greatest portion of drying, and then depending on the weather, it may take us a second or a third day to get cured out all the way. Now I've dropped this table in here mainly for your reference, but I'll make a few points about it. This is from a chapter I wrote on horse hay. And it has the dimensions, the weights, the densities, and safe baling moistures for various bale shapes. So we've got the rectangular bales, and the first one is the 14 by 18 by 36 or 40 inches regular small square bales, and that safe moisture content is about 18 to 20%. Then we've got what we call 3 by 3 by 8s. In this case, you can see it's not quite that. Safe moisture, and the bale weight's about 900 pounds. The safe moisture is 12 to 16%. Then a little larger rectangular bales, the 4 by 4 by 8s, which are almost a ton, and they're also 12 to 16%. And then you get the various versions of the round bales, 4 by 4s, and a lot of times, 4 feet high, 4 feet wide. There's a 4 by 5, a 5 foot high, 4 foot wide, which winds up being a common size because you can get two of them side by side on an 8 foot wide trailer. And if you look at that bale, it's about 1,000 pounds, safe moisture content 15 to 18%. So the larger the package, the lower the moisture content it needs to be for safe baling without heating or molding. And I'll just make one point about hay heating, and I probably could spend more time on this, but when you bale up hay that's above 15 to 18% in a small square bale or a large bale, either one, when it's too moist, or it is going to do, it's going to heat. And it heats from plant respiration, and it heats from fungi, aspergillus and fusarium, and bacteria that are present. And depending on the temperature, other microbes may become active, including the heat-resistant thermophilic fungi, the bacteria, or actinomycetes. So if you bale hay, it always goes through what we call a sweat. It's going to, for the about 10 days to 2 weeks, it's gonna rise in temperature and then decline as the plant respiration finishes, and it's just going to do that. And the temperature may rise up moderately into the 120, 125 range. That's not going to be uncommon. But if you start getting temperatures into the 130, 40, 50 range, then we're in danger of getting into this zone where we need to monitor the temperature and maybe promote the circulation of air in a haystack. When you get above 150, then what really is happening is that bale maybe is already burning already, in that it is consuming itself, and it's doing that with these. It's beginning to burn. Now, one of the tricky things is when you get into this 150, 160, 170 degree ranges, what do you do with the hay? So if you think you have got moist hay, what most people do is leave it in the field for 2 weeks until it has had a chance to go through the sweat and it's not up against a bunch of other hay and compressed and put together such that you get this real kind of furnace effect. Because once a stack of hay begins to burn, it is just almost impossible to put it out. And if you're trying to move hay out that's smoldering, the fact that oxygen then gets into that, you're letting oxygen into that stack, is going to actually make it worse, and it's quite dangerous. So hay heating is a real thing. Hay heating is important for us to avoid. You do that by getting the hay dry enough. So come to one of the natural breaking points in this lecture. So what we're going to do next, after we sign off, is the next lecture or series of slides is going to be on hay equipment. So thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you then next to talk about hay equipment.